Do you hear it? Do you hear the sweet, sweet sound of jazz? The 1920s came in fast and hot. The soundtrack was sweet, 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 and it was all because of the sound. That was jazz.
Jazz music originated in New Orleans and began to spread throughout the country. It originally began in 1917 during World War I. While the soldiers were away at war, the people back at home had begun to grow restless. Many whites slowly began to take up interest in African American culture. They analyzed Harlem nightclubs, where they spotlighted numerous artists such as jazz musicians Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Jazz music developed in the 1920s as a mesh of African American traditions and white middle-class ideals, and represented a cultural shift. The decade of the 1920s marked huge advances in the music industry. It increased music sales with things like phonograph and piano sheets. Toward the end of the decade, radio went from being an expensive novelty into a major purveyor of inexpensive entertainment. Motion pictures had gone from silent to sound, creating another medium for the sale of sheet music and phonograph sale. The jazz age not only changed the way music was brought about, but brought in new music styles such as the blues, allowing not only blacks to create this special type of music, but mixing the white race in as well.
Music of the 1920s changed the ways of entertainment. Different music styles such as vaudeville, jazz, ragtime, and blues influenced some of the most well-known dance crazes in history. Dances like Black Bottom, the Charleston, and shag were influenced by jazz music. Dances like the foxtrot and the one-step were influenced by ragtime music. Broadway dances and shows were influenced by vaudeville composers and musicians. The 1920s was also a time where African American artists became popular and wrote huge hits in the music industry. African American artists went to play in front of big crowds composed of white citizens. The 1920s was also a time where new technologies began to trend. New technologies such as the radio changed the way that people listened to music. Radio stations played major hits and broadcasted them throughout cities and towns. Since the only way to have your song be played on the radio was having a demo, record deals and studios were starting to become popular everywhere. People of different races who were passionate about making music and wanting people to hear their work decided to record their music and hoped that a record producer or radio station would love it and make it famous. Once records were produced, record sales blew through the roof. Everyone had to have the records of the biggest hits, sung by the biggest artists. At that point, the 20s became known as the Jazz Age.
And here's a short video showing you what you just saw.
In addition to the economic, industrial, and social changes that were taking place in America during the 1920s, an artistic and cultural renaissance occurred. This cultural movement led many to nickname the decade the Jazz Age. This renaissance got its start in African American communities. Perhaps one of the greatest contributions made to American culture during the 20s came in the form of music. African American musicians first developed jazz in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Jazz musicians combined the sounds of the Caribbean, West Africa, and the cotton fields of the rural South into a uniquely American musical form. Ideal for dancing, the new sound quickly gained popularity in speakeasies and nightclubs from New York to Chicago. Cornet player and bandleader Louis Armstrong, composer Duke Ellington, and singer Bessie Smith were just some of the many people who helped create and refine jazz. Clarinetist Benny Goodman and other white musicians also performed jazz, which helped popularize it. And as radios became cheaper and more common in American homes, jazz spread even further. The popular composer George Gershwin debuted Rhapsody in Blue in New York in 1924. That composition was heavily influenced by jazz. Jazz was particularly popular with young people who flocked to nightclubs and speakeasies to dance the Charleston. The Charleston also had its origins in African American culture, but whites as well as blacks were drawn to the dance's energetic movements and the upbeat tempos and infectious rhythms of jazz. Jazz also influenced the fashions worn in the 20s. The Charleston's fast movements made the loose, high-cut dresses worn by flappers mandatory. Young women cut their hair short, and men wore baggy pants known as Oxford bags. Jazz culture also made its way into the literature of the day. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald reflected the carefree youth culture and post-war ideals of the jazz generation, a generation committed to having a good time while breaking down the accepted social standards of behavior. While the sexes may have become more equal during the jazz age, barriers between the races remained. Many jazz clubs, including the famous Cotton Club in New York City's Harlem neighborhood, let in white customers only. Although it would take decades before African Americans would gain the same rights as whites, the popularity of jazz helped elevate their status in society. But jazz was just one part of a cultural movement taking place in New York during the 1920s. Called the Harlem Renaissance, this movement included literature and politics too. Writer Langston Hughes helped introduce African American culture and concerns to the world. His jazz-inspired poetry was praised for the beauty of his words and for its moving expressions of racial pride. Political leader Marcus Garvey epitomized this racial pride. Born in Jamaica, Garvey was the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Designed to promote the spirit of race pride, the UNIA worked to foster worldwide unity among all blacks. Garvey urged blacks to create an independent economy. He encouraged founding a new nation in Africa that would provide African Americans the liberties they were denied at home. Although many Americans resisted the social changes taking place during the 1920s, the Jazz Age marked the first time that African American music and culture made their way into popular culture. And for the first time in America, the culture of a minority was embraced by the majority.
With this time era, you saw some of the best jazz players in the world, like Duke Ellington, and my personal favorite, Louis Armstrong. These men changed our eras and lives that we couldn't understand. With the era ending, the music still lives on, but now these people influence what we know as today as the greats. These people influence the Beatles, Kanye West, Beyonce, and even Avenged Sevenfold. These people will live throughout the ages as the greats and help influence America's music industry.